warm welcome back again to our ongoing series, almost a year now, about the glories of our beloved Sri Vrindavan Dham and many of the saints and sages who had their pastimes there. But first, Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Pashtaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nivishesha Shunyavadi Paschata Deshatarane. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. So, today we will have our third and final lecture on he who is most dear to us, Srila Narottam Das Thakur. I was reading the other day that because he was born into a royal family, in his youth, people used to call him Rajakumar. And when his glories became evident to everyone, then they called him Thakur Mahasaya. And even today, his transcendental exploits are known to the people of Bengal, Orissa, and Vrindavan, and of course, now in our International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And our movement is propagating his glories also throughout the world. And of course, for the rest of history, it's said that Mahaprabhu's Sankirtan movement will flourish for 10,000 years. People can come in contact with this great saint, Narottam Das Thakur, and be introduced to the process for reaching perfection in spiritual life through, again, the two books he left us, Prarthana and Prem Bhakti Chandrika. We mentioned them in a previous lecture, but Prabhupada said repetition of something is necessary to realize the fact. So, Prarthana and Prem Bhakti Chandrika, I read these books all the time. And someone can say, how can one reach perfection with only two books? Or how can the absolute truth be fully realized in two song books? Because actually his poems are organized in such a way that they're songs, they're sung. So someone can say, how can you reach spiritual enlightenment, but with two song books? Well, we hear in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Kaviraj Goswami, Adi Lila, part 1, verse 106, there's the aphorism. Mitam cha sharam chavachohi mag mita, vagmita. Essential truth spoken concisely is true eloquence. Essential truth spoken concisely is true eloquence. Like the book Prarthana, for example. It's 33 Bengali songs divided into 258 verses, arranged in 55 sections. And but it deals with everything. I was just reading it. It deals with prayer, self-analysis or self-criticism, mental training, spiritual happiness, the agony of being separated from God, from Krishna, the superiority of Vaishnavism, what are the topmost aspirations that we should aspire for. It talks about the guru-disciple relationship. It talks about residence in Braj, in Vrindavan, the importance of asceticism or renunciation, and a lot about the humility of a Vaishnava. And most significantly, a major portion of Prarthana focuses on Manjari Bhav, or let us say Manjari Sadhana, which is the esoteric form of Gaudiya practice by which one visualizes oneself eventually as a servant of Vrindavaneshwari Srimati Radharani. And it's described that because she is very dear to Krishna, that is, quote, the secret way to Krishna's heart. The secret way to Krishna's heart. Now, Prem Bhakti Chandrika is a lengthy poem, 120 verses divided into 9 sections. And if you carefully study it, you'll see that it reveals our entire Gaudiya philosophy. Eloquence is truth spoken concisely again. Prem Bhakti Chandrika reveals our entire Gaudiya philosophy, let us say in a seed-like form. And many scholars accept it as a masterpiece of Bengali poetry. And I found that Srila Vishwanath Chakravarthi Thakur, another one of our heroes, he wrote a Sanskrit commentary on Prem Bhakti Chandrika, just showing us how important is this work to Gaudiya Vaishnavas. So Prarthana and Prem Bhakti Chandrika again. So in our last lecture, we finished with the conclusion of the very first Gaur Purnim festival in Kaituri, where Lord Chaitanya and the Panchatattva and many of their intimate associates, they miraculously made a full appearance for the pleasure of all the devotees. Now, after that historic event, Narottam Das Thakur very quickly became the most famous Vaishnav guru in all of Bengal and Orissa. His poetry, his simple language, his lectures, his incredible, beautiful singing voice made him a legend in his own lifetime. Generally, people become legends after the fact, after they've departed. But Narottam was a legend in his own lifetime. And as a result, many persons came forward and begged to become his disciples. And there's a nice pastime in this regard I'd like to share with you. One time Narottam and his dearmost friend, Ramchandra Kaviraj, went to take their baths in the Padma River. Now on their way, they saw 2 Brahmana boys herding young goats, sheep, and buffaloes. Why? Because the celebration of Durga Puja was coming soon, and their famous father, Shivai Acharya, was planning to sacrifice the animals as an offering to the goddess Durga, as a means, you could say, of being elevated to Svargaloka. So taking compassion on these 2 boys, Narottam and Ramachandra Kaviraj, they purposely kind of moved closer to where the boys were herding the animals, and they began to discuss different shastras in voices loud enough that the boys could hear. And in particular, they discussed the superiority of worshipping the Supreme Lord, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, over worship of the devatas, and how chanting the Lord's holy names was the means of achieving perfection in the age of Kali. And they also stressed how there was no need to sacrifice animals. Now the 2 boys overheard the conversation, and they became curious. The Shastra Narottam Vilas says they thought as follows, and I quote, the boys are thinking, most probably these 2 Vaishnavas are the famous Sri Thakur Mahasaya and Ramchandra Kaviraj. We've heard about their glory. Let's move a little closer to hear from them now. Let's move in a little closer. Just by that, Shabda Brahma, hearing that sound, it ignited a fire within their heart. Sadhu Sangha, Sarva Shastakoi, Lavamatra Sadhu Sangha, Sarva Siddhi Hoy. Chaitanya Charitamrita, Kaviraj Goswami says that just even a moment's association with a saintly person can begin one on the path of perfection. And what is the nature of that association? You hear. Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Shmaranam. Hearing, then chanting, brings Vishnu Shmaranam or Krishna Shmaranam, remembrance of Krishna. So this ignited a fire within their heart. And they moved a little closer. Actually, they went to meet Narottam Das Thakur, Ramchandra Kaviraj. And Narottam Vilas says that as they came closer to the two saints, Narottam and Ramachandra, the two boys, their hearts were swinging like pendulums. That's how it's described. Narottam Vilas says that their hearts were swinging back and forth, beating. So as they approached Narottam spoke up first. He said, so, young men, what are your names and who is your father? So one boy said, I am Hariram, and this is my younger brother, Ramakrishna. And our father is the great Durga Bhakta Shiva Acharya. And he has requested us to bring these animals for sacrificing to the goddess Bhavani, another name for Durga. However, we have realized the futility of this in hearing you two saints converse. So then both Hariram and Ramakrishna, they fell down before Ramchandra Kaviraj and Narottam Das Thakur. And they begged for shelter at their lotus feet. We can see the process doesn't have to go on too long. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to procrastinate. We can fully surrender immediately. Why not? And being the kind souls they were, Narottam and Ramachandra picked the boys up and embraced them. And then they invited them to come back to the temple and the ashram at Keturi, where those 5 deities of Krishna and the golden deity of Gauranga had recently been installed and established. And again, the association of Narottam and Ramachandra had profound effect on these two boys. So they spent the night. And the next day they came forth, and very humbly, they begged to be initiated. It happens like that sometimes. In the Shastra, Tattva Shagara, it's stated, Durlabhe Sad Guru Namcha Sukrit Sangha Upastite Tad Anuj Sha Yada Labda Sadiksha Vasharo Mahan. Quote, if by chance one gets a Sadguru, it doesn't matter whether one is in the temple or in the forest. If the Sadguru, the bona fide spiritual master, agrees, one can be initiated immediately without waiting for a suitable time or place. Yes, why not? Life is short and then you die. It's important we seek out, take shelter, and we get initiated by a bona fide spiritual master. It's the priority, you could say, in life. Everything else comes after that. Because by that act, we will become enlightened and hopefully go back home, back to Godhead. So appreciating their sincerity, Narottam Das Thakur agreed, and he initiated Ramakrishna. And Ramchandra Kaviraj initiated Hariram. So the boys spent 10 days with Ramchandra Kaviraj and Narottam Das Thakur studying the Bhakti Shastras of the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan. And the boys learned quickly. And what's more, Narottam Vilas describes that they realized those teachings within their heart. And on the 11th day, the day after Vijay Dashami, which is that's the 10th day of the worshipping of goddess Durga, Bhavani, the boys left to return home to their father, Sri Vayacharya. Now, on the way, they spent one night at the residence of their father's physician, their father's doctor. His name was Balaram, and he was a well-educated, intelligent physician, a very devoted follower of Durga Ma, Mother Durga, but not a person very well learned in Shastra. Nevertheless, while they were there, for several hours, the newly initiated boys, they shared with Balaram all the very deep philosophy and the esoteric teachings they had learned from Narottam and Ramachandra. And by the mercy of those two boys, because mercy is something that's passed on, this Balaram, the physician, this doctor, he converted into a Vaisnava, a Gaudiya Vaisnava, in just a few hours. So again, sadhu sangha, sarvashastakoi. So the next day, Harinam and Hariram and Ramakrishna, they arrived home, and upon seeing his sons and hearing from them all that had transpired, their father, Shivayacharya, he became extremely angry. And he shouted at them, "You foolish boys, you're young brahmanas. How is it that you've taken diksha, initiation, from these low-born Vaishnavas, Narottama and Ramachandra? What's more, by not bringing me the animals for sacrifice, you have offended Durga, and you have spoiled your lives." So, hearing his father speak like this, Hariram became furious, and he said firmly, quote, "Father, you are mistaken. Vaishnavas are automatically brahmanas, and what's more, they're on a higher platform, Shuddha-sattva, above even the mode of goodness. And there's no need to worship the devatas, who are all really just surrendered servants of Sri Hari," he said to his father. So with great effort, it's described, Shivayacharya controlled his rage. And he said, "So son, if you think you're so smart to challenge my authority with such audacious language, then let's settle the matter as brahmanas in a debate with scholars." So confident of what he'd learned from Narottam Das Thakur and Ramchandra Kaviraj, Hariram said, "Yes, let the Pandits come, let the Durga Pandits come and display their ignorance," unquote. So infuriated even more now, Shivayacharya quickly assembled all of his celebrated Pandits, and they were learned, but learned in a certain portion of the scriptures, describing the devatas. And Narottam Vilas says, then, quote, "Hariram, proud like a lion, then shastrically and authoritatively refuted all the arguments of those Pandits and established the superiority of devotion to Sri Krishna as the absolute truth," unquote. And these Pandits, defeated and dejected in every respect, stared at Hariram and said, "How has such a young boy so quickly mastered all the Shastras?" Because they were young. How has such a young boy so quickly mastered all the scriptures? But Hariram and Ramakrishna's father, Shivayacharya, it's described he wasn't ready to accept defeat. So he called forth a Pandit, respected Pandit, Murari Pandit, who was one of those Digvijayas that we sometimes mention. A Digvijaya means a scholar or a Pandit who travels, and his vocation is to, debate with and defeat other Pandits and other scholars. It appeared that was a tradition going on in those days. But this particular Murari Pandit, he was known as, quote, the conquering scholar of Mithila. The conquering scholar of Mithila. Everyone feared him. And Narottam Vilas says he was such a big scholar that, quote, he was so proud of his knowledge that he looked upon other scholars like grass under his feet. If one's not careful, sometimes knowledge can make one feel proud, like it's their knowledge. And so one has to remain very humble. Remember from where the mercy is coming from. So he was very arrogant. So a debate what was arranged between him, his father said, okay, these other pandits couldn't defeat my sons, but the reigning, conquering scholar of Mithila certainly have put my boys in their place, and they'll realize the importance of Durga Ma. So a debate was scheduled. But to have a little bit of fun, and I found this so interesting, a little bit of fun, Hare Rama and Ramakrishna went to Balaram. You remember that their father's doctor, and they said, we discussed the philosophy with you. You debate with the conquering scholar of Mithila. So Balaram, he said, yeah, sure. So confident he was of this philosophy. Actually, our philosophy is undefeatable. I've seen godbrothers like, Hridayananda Maharaj, Dravida Prabhu, Jaya Swami, in debates with people of other spiritual traditions, with all due respect, and they shine forth. There's nothing that compares. Our philosophy is perfect and complete, and when it's given by an intelligent, pure-hearted Vaisnava, undefeatable. We have a number of scholars like that in our movement, thank God. And so, Balaram, he only, they spent the night at his house, but he was so sincere, and the two boys were so pure and powerful that, he imbibed that, and he realized that. So Balaram said, sure. So Balaram, the court physician, who'd only had 3 hours of philosophy from the mouths of two boys who'd been blessed by Narottam Das Thakur and Ramchandra Kaviraj. It all comes from blessings, actually. He sat down with the Digvijay, who had never been defeated in his entire life. He was an older person. And in those days, if you defeated someone in philosophy, they became your disciple. And if they didn't want to become your disciple, the only other option they had was to commit suicide. That was the tradition. By drowning themselves in a sacred river. And out of humiliation, that's what happens sometimes. So this Digvijay, he sat down with great confidence to debate with this, what he considered this physician, this doctor. The king was there, the court pandits were there, Hare Ram was there, Ram Krishna was there, sitting nearby. And I read that from the moment the debate began, the conquering scholar of Mithila was on the defensive. And within no time he was humiliated, shamed, and defeated by Balaram, the doctor. And at that, at least for the Digvijay, that inglorious moment, he said, his name was actually again Murari Pandit, he said, quote, "It is impossible for me to grasp the limit of the glory of these Vaishnavas." You could say he accepted his defeat with humility. It is impossible for me to grasp the limit of the glory of these Vaishnavas, and that is true. And after saying this, he distributed his belongings to those present, and he banished himself to the forest to live the life of a hermit, and he was never seen again. And stunned by all that he'd witnessed, Shivayacharya, he expressed remorse for insulting the Vaishnavas. He stood up and he publicly, this was the tradition, he stood up and he admitted his weakness and his misunderstandings and his offenses, and he expressed remorse for insulting the Vaishnavas. And it's mentioned that night when he went to sleep, his worshipable deity, Durga, Bhavani, appeared to him. And she said, "My dear Shivai, make no mistake. Vishnu, Krishna is supreme, and I am nothing more than his humble servant. I'm just doing a thankless task of keeping the conditioned souls in this material world until they show a sincerity for awakening their love for my Lord, Sri Krishna. You accept Krishna immediately as your worshipable Lord, or I'll make sure your head rolls. So the very next morning, Shivayacharya woke up and he ran to where Narottam Das Thakur was. He fell at his feet. And what did he do? He asked to become his disciple. We're discussing, initially in the beginning here, we were discussing how Narottam Das Thakur's fame spread very quickly. And as a result, so many people came to his lotus feet for shelter in various ways, obviously. And I read after several days, Narottama initiated him. He was so kind. So, empowered by the mercy of their spiritual masters, Hariram and Ramakrishna became very active. They engaged themselves in doing Sankirtan, daily Sankirtan. Every day throughout the many towns and villages in the area, they would go on Sankirtan, and they chant Hare Krishna with some of their friends. Nagar Sankirtan it's called. And one day, these two brothers, they wandered down to the bank of the Ganges, not far from their home. It was a place favored by well-known Brahmana scholars who would come to discuss the scriptures. Smarta Brahmanas, caste-conscious Brahmanas. And when Hari Rama and Ramakrishna arrived down at that ghat, the most prominent scholar of the time, his name was Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi. We mentioned him the other day, Ganga Narayan. He was lecturing. But whereas the majority of the Brahmanas there looked at the two boys who had come down with disdain, Ganga Narayan observed them with a curiosity. Narottam Vilas says he had been, quote, secretly inquiring about Hari Rama and Ramakrishna after hearing about their initiation from the Kayashta Shudra, low-born Narottam Das Thakur. And as he spoke, Ganga Narayan kept glancing at them, and he was thinking. This is the thinking it's described in Narottam Vilas' quote. They weren't like this before. Just see what a change has come over them. Ramchandra Kaviraj and Sri Thakur Mahasaya have favored them, and now they have become Vaisnavas. And I've heard they're very learned in all the scriptures. And I, a Brahmana, proud of my knowledge, I've been neglected by Narottam Das Thakur. I think my only hope is to gain his favor. I've heard he is very merciful. And thinking like this is going on, he's lecturing to a large crowd of esteemed Brahmanas. But he's glancing over, and while he's speaking, he's looking at these two boys who, even by their external, right, the face is an index of the mind, they're just shining. They're standing in a certain way, they're dressed in a certain way, they're speaking in a certain way. They become Vaishnavas, representatives of their gurus and the Supreme Lord. They change of heart. Like a caterpillar turns into a butterfly. So he's observing this change, and he's speaking, but as he's meditating on this transformation, Ganga Narayan begins to weep. And his audience was dumbfounded at this outburst of emotion while he's lecturing. So they said, please stop, take some rest. They thought maybe he had overexerted himself. So he stopped lecturing. And but that night, Ganga Narayan, as he was Chakravarthi, as he was sleeping, Narottam Das Thakur appeared to him in a dream, in a vision. I pray for such a dream someday. And Narottam said to him, "My dear Ganga Narayan Chakravarti, you are my eternal servant. Please do not lament. All your desires will be fulfilled. Tomorrow, while taking your bath in the Ganges, you will have my darshan. At that time, I will come and speak to you." And elated that Thakur Mahasaya had spontaneously appeared to him in a dream, the next morning, Ganga Narayan Chakravarti, he left a little early to take his bath at the Ganges. And soon after that, Hari Ram and Ramakrishna, they also came down to that ghat to take their baths. And Ganga Narayan Chakravarti had the opportunity to actually meet them. So they're young boys, and he's a very esteemed, famous scholar. But he very humbly said to them, "Please, won't you boys stay with me here? I will soon be blessed by the association of your spiritual master," unquote. So they stayed with him. And not long after that, our Thakur Mahasaya, Narottam Das Thakur, he came down to the Ganges with a few disciples to that ghat. And when Ganga Narayan Chakravarti looked at Narottam Das Thakur, he just had this impression that he looks just like he did in my dream, in my vision. And when you see these personalities, you can understand they're not of this world. I many times mentioned how one time Srila Prabhupada on a morning walk in London, he was walking with some of his disciples, and they were crossing a street in London. And one of the bobbies, means the London policeman, he grabbed, I believe it was Shamasundar's kirtan. He said, look, your teacher's glowing like the sun." So when Ganga Narayan Chakravarti saw Narottam, he said, "Oh, he looks as effulgent as he did in my dream." So then Ganga Narayan Chakravarti, he came and he fell at the feet of Narottam Das Thakur. And it's described that Narottam Das Thakur then in a trance of love, he was in a trance of love, he picked up Ganga Narayan Chakravarti and he embraced him. And in a very sweet voice, Narottam asked Ganga Narayan, "Won't the other brahmanas object to your submission and affection for me?" And Ganga Narayan Chakravarti, he was convinced, like Vaisnavas are convinced, we have made the right decision. We have made the right decision. And Ganga Narayan Chakravarti, he replied to Narottam Das Thakur, he said, quote, "My Lord, you have favored this poor soul. As a result, I have no concern what any brahmana devoid of Krishna bhakti may say." Of course, there's many brahmanas who are Pakka brahmanas, they're not smarta brahmanas. But he said that, as a result, I have no concern what any brahmana devoid of Krishna bhakti may say. And by this time, a small crowd of people had gathered. And Narottam Vilas says that they all began to praise the good fortune of Ganga Narayan. And then, as you can imagine, several days later, on an auspicious day, Narottam Das Thakur welcomes Ganga Narayan Chakravarti into her highly esteemed Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. And then soon after, he initiated him. And then soon after, Ganga Narayan Chakravarti, it's described in Shastra that he was quote, a genius of all scriptures. But he took the time to sit down and study the Bhakti Shastras of the Goswamis, which Srila Prabhupada has very kindly given to us in all of his books. The Bhaktivedanta purports. It's given us the Bhaktivedanta purports, which he said one time are his ecstasies. So it's mentioned that as a result, Ganga Narayan Chakravarti began to swim in a continuous stream of happiness. And very soon he achieved the highest state of devotion for the divine couple. Now, as Narottam continued to accept disciples, really people from all walks of life came forward. Kings, queens, aristocrats, intellectuals, people who were very fallen, Kalo Shudra Shambhavan, it's the age of Kali, people who were you could say outside of the jurisdiction of Vedic culture, tribal people, sinful people. They all begged for shelter at his lotus feet. He was a self-effulgent acharya. And brahmanas. And by accepting those from the Brahminical order, this became a controversy. By accepting those from the Brahminical order, this created a major controversy in society at that time. In late 16th century India, caste distinctions played a powerful factor in society. One was considered a Sudra, a laborer, a Vaishya, a businessman, a Kshatriya, an administrator, a warrior, or a Brahmana, a priest or intellectual, by birth, and by birth only. And there was very little social intercourse between these orders, other than, some practical affairs like shopping or transportation. They lived separately, their own little parts of the town. And as we've heard many times, the caste-conscious Brahmins considered themselves far superior to the others, and even looked down upon them with disdain. Of course, this is all a perversion of these natural orders in society. There's naturally workers, there's naturally people who like to farm and do business, there's naturally people who like to administrate, there's naturally intellectuals. So we say this was a perversion of these natural orders of society. In Vedic culture, one's status in society is not determined by birth. That may be an advantage, but it's not determined by birth, it's by qualification. What's more, Srila Prabhupada has said, it's the duty of a first-class man to make a fifth-class man also a first-class man. Meaning a Brahmana, by birth or by qualification, should educate and train others if they want, if they're willing, to come up to the status of Brahmana. And it's possible by proper training from a bona fide spiritual master. In Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Leela, chapter 7, verse 47, there's that famous verse, Kata kaschantanam yati kamsham rasa vida nataha tata diksha vidanena dujatam jayate nunam. Quote, as bell metal is turned to gold when mixed with mercury in a alchemical process, a mystical process, so one who is properly trained and initiated by a bona fide spiritual master immediately becomes a Brahmin. You take bell metal and you mix it with mercury it's kind of a mystical way, and you can produce gold. It's amazing, but it was possible in those days if you knew the science. Actually, I read about the science. It's a yogi who has mystic powers. He would drink mercury and be unaffected by the mercury. But the mercury mixing with certain elements in his body and by certain mantras he would chant it, then in the morning when he would answer the call of nature, he would pass the urine. He would pass the urine on bell metal, it would turn to gold. It sounds unbelievable, but many of the things that the scientists are telling us these days are inconceivable. Really? You'll say? Because it's beyond the layman to understand. But so many people accept the conclusions of the scientists. So we accept the conclusions of Guru, Shastra, and Sadhu. Prabhupada said, when Janaka Pandit said, don't Don't trust a person who can't control their senses. But the Guru Shastra and Sadhu, everything is very controlled, is coming down through Guru Parampara, and these perfected souls are explaining it to us. So we have faith in Guru Shastra and Sadhu. So when it's said that the yogi would drink the mercury, he'd pass urine on the bell metal, it turns to gold, okay. And no less amazing may be the fact that, a low-born person or a sinful person, if he agrees to chant 16 rounds, follow the 4 regulative principles, live in the association of devotees, share his good fortune with others, becomes a brahmana. But even higher than a brahmana is a Vaisnava or a Vaishnavi who is situated in Suddha Sattva. There's the mode of ignorance, the mode of passion, and the mode of goodness. And the mode of goodness is the best for advancing in spiritual life. So by his lifestyle, a brahmana comes to the mode of goodness. But a Vaishnava will see the mode of goodness as a stepping stone into transcendence, or Shuddha Sattva. So by living a Brahminical life following Vaishnava principles, one comes to that stage of Shuddha Sattva. And that the possibility of becoming a Vaishnava is open to all classes of people. And such an opportunity helps one transcend this world. I was reading Chaitanya Bhagavat the other day, and there's a nice verse, how a Vaishnava or Vaishnavi is situated. Yata deka Vaishnava vera yavahara dukkha nishchaya janhiya taha para mananda shukaha. Quote, a Vaishnava is always firmly situated in transcendental bliss because of engagement in devotional service. Although he may appear to suffer material pains, his position is called transcendental bliss in separation, viraha, from Krishna. It's quite deep, esoteric. What is the pain of Vaishnava experiences? It's the pain of separation from devotees or the Supreme Lord. So Vaishnava is always firmly situated in transcendental bliss because of engagement in devotional service. Although he may appear to suffer material pains, his position is called transcendental bliss in separation, viraha. So we have this opportunity to the degree that we surrender and the degree we take up the practice. We can elevate beyond ignorance, passion, even mundane goodness. And from time to time we get those glimpses, isn't it, of transcendence. There's that day when you really chant your rounds. There's that day when you meet a very nice devotee, a very nice sadhu. There's that special Sunday program. There's that special feast cooked with so much devotion and offered to the deity with love. And we have those glimpses. But they will become more, they become more, they'll come to us more and more as time goes on, and eventually, we'll see. And so it's possible to elevate anyone from any status of life to a brahmana, and what's more, to a Shuddha Sattva, beyond the modes of nature, by the process of diksha and training. And we must also remember that the Lord himself has incarnated in this age of Kali Yuga to deliver the lowest to the highest. Namo Mahabhadanaya Krishna Prem Padayate Krishna Krishna Chaitanya Namne Guru Tushre Namaha. Rupa Goswami, upon having his first darshan of Mahaprabhu, he said, who is this incarnation? This Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the combined form of Radha and Krishna. It's simply inconceivable. He's appeared in the age of Kali, where there's no good qualities left. He's appeared in the age of Kali to give the people of Kali Yuga the understanding of Braj Bhakti and the process to elevate him to that advanced stage through the chanting of Hare Krishna Mahamantra. So that alone explains it, that the Lord himself has come to deliver the most fallen. And that's so nicely explained by our beloved Prabodhananda Saraswati in one of our favorite scriptures, Sri Chaitanya Chandamrita text number 2, very early, he explains that how Mahaprabhu has come to elevate people beyond Brahminical status, to transcendence, not even to Vaikuntha, but to Goloka Vrindavan. Prabodhananda Saraswati puts it so nicely. He writes, quote, I offer my obeisances to that supremely powerful personality, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, whose wonderful characteristics are not possible to fully describe. Even the most sinful persons, devoid of all righteousness, steeped in the depths of wickedness, who shun the company of saintly souls, thus removing themselves from their merciful vision, and who never visit holy places sanctified by those devotees' presence. Such fools, now suddenly reformed, dance, sing loudly, and roll on the ground in ecstasy, overcome by the intoxicating effects of the mellows of Krishna Prema, having drunk from the hand of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, this nectarian ambrosia of the loving devotion to Sri Sri Radha and Krishna. Unquote. Hare Krishna. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu ki. So as we know, Narottam Das Thakur was that Lord's representative. Mahaprabhu called upon him. Many are called, but few are chosen. He was the chosen son, one of the chosen sons, after the departure of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, to carry on that movement which he inaugurated. He was a Nitya Siddha, an eternally liberated soul. He wasn't a Kayastha Sudra. He's a Nitya Siddha, fully empowered to deliver the worst offenders. And he had every right to initiate. Unfortunately, the Brahminical community in Bengal and Orissa at that time could not accept this. And so many of them, from my readings I see, many of them formed a large group, you could say like an organization, to contest Narottam's, quote, inappropriate actions, as they described them. And in their efforts to stop him, because he was initiating left, right, and center, that the movement was spreading wildly because everyone had a chance. Before it was only the Brahmanas. Only if you're born in a Brahmin family, could you study the scriptures? Could you perform priestly activities? Could you take sannyas? Could you achieve, well, now everybody. So it's spreading very quickly because, especially at that time, we understand India is a very pious country. So in their efforts to stop Narottam, the leaders of the Brahminical community approached a very powerful and influential and pious king. I love his name, Raj Narasimha. That's his name. This Raj, king means king, Raj Narasimha, who ruled the province of Pakapali. He was the king of a province, Pakapali, which I looked on a map, an old map, it was some distance from Keturi. And they said to him, Brahmins are respected. So they came to the king and they said, the kings took counsel from Brahmins. They told the king that Narottam was a low-born person and therefore should not be accepting as disciples those who were Brahmins by birth, such as Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi, which was really their leader in one sense before. So they insisted that the king inflict a severe punishment on Narottam Das Thakur. So, the king's a diplomat. He has, he wants to keep the peace, so he's got to use diplomacy here. He's a pious king. So, but some diplomacy had to be employed here. Obviously, he'd also heard of Narottam. So Raj Narasimha, he sent a message to Narottam, asking how is it that you can disobey the injunctions of Shastra? So Narottam wrote back. He replied that there was nothing in the scriptures, if properly understood, to uphold the opinion of these caste-conscious brahmanas. And he was willing to have a debate to prove it. So, and there was more. He outlined everything about, who's a Vaisnava, or what is a Vaisnava. And after carefully studying Narottam's letter, Raj Narasimha was convinced that Narottam was correct. Nevertheless, he's diplomatic. He gathered together a group of the greatest scholars of Bengal at that time, including the famous Sri Rupa Narayan Pandit, perhaps the greatest scholar at that time in that part of India. The king assembled all these pundits, and along with all those brahmanas who were complaining, he said, okay, we'll have this debate. This is how many things were solved in those days. Now, you go to war with, missiles and atomic weapons and you obliterate everything. The gentleman, there's a debate going on. You debate it. You discuss it by philosophy, with intelligence. What is the proper intelligent way to resolve this problem? What's the intelligent conclusion? So the Brahmins were complaining, so the king said, okay, Narottam's agreed to a debate. He assembled the best pundits of the time, including Sri Rupa Narayan Pandit, and they all marched towards Kituri, including the king, to debate with Narottam. In the meantime, Narottam's two dearmost associates, now you could say, Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi became very dear to Narottam Das Thakur, and Ramchandra Kaviraj, like his bosom buddy, his best friend. These two devotees, Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi and Ramchandra Kaviraj, they came up with a clever plan so that Narottam wouldn't have to waste time with those who were envious of him, all these brahmanas. So what they did is Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi, he disguised himself as a humble potter, put on those clothes, got all the pots and, the things for making pottery. And Ramchandra Kaviraj disguised himself as the seller of betel nuts. And they set up small shops in an area known as Kamarapur, which at that time was just outside Keturi Gram, along the roadway, where the king and all these pundits and, would be passing. So it took some time. There's some distance between where the king lived and where Keturi was, the different kingdoms. So finally, when this entourage passed by, the students of the pundits who had come to debate, they're serving their pundit masters, they asked if the caravan could stop. They needed supplies, so the students got off and they went to the roadside stands to purchase some supplies. And, they're buying some pots and they're buying some betel nut. While they're buying the pot and the betel nut, the sellers, who are Ganga Narayan and Ramachandra in disguise, they're speaking fluent Sanskrit to the students. And the students like, what? These pot sellers, betel nut sellers, they're speaking fluent Sanskrit, I read Prabhupada said one time, it takes 30 years to master Sanskrit. 30 years. So, it's a difficult language. So, and then some debates started going on, Ganga Narayan and Ramachandra, they initiated some philosophy there. And then the students, they couldn't deal with the philosophy. They were defeated. So the students returned to the caravan, where they said to their teachers, the pandits, it appears that the shopkeepers in Keturi speak Sanskrit and are very expert in debate. So these pundits, they got a little curious and a little bit worried that, pot sellers and betel nut sellers, they're able to defeat the philosophy that they were teaching their own students. So they asked the students to guide them to the shopkeepers. And to make a long story short, those pandits also engaged in a fluent Sanskrit debate with the pot seller and the betel nut seller. And they were defeated right then and there. And the most difficult, complex, arguments and rhetoric and, whatever. And they were humiliated. And they went, their leader, Narayan, the biggest pundit, he was observing it all. And they all concluded that if, in Narottam's town, Keturi, the potters and betel nut sellers, because they were imagining that all the rest in town would be like that, were such accomplished scholars, what would it be like to encounter Narottam Das Thakur? So, they became nervous and they kind of said, well, maybe we should go home now. And so Raj Narasimha, who was sympathetic to Narottam from the very beginning, he said, okay, you can save some face, you can go home. You go home. So that night everyone, took rest. But that night, Durga Ma, who has that thankless task of keeping people here until they want to become Krishna conscious. She's a pure devotee, actually. She's an expansion of Yoga Maya, actually, Purnamasi. She appeared in a dream to Rupa Narayana Pandit, the big Pandit. And she was holding a sword like this above her head. And and she was very angry. She had bloodshot eyes. She said to Shri Rupa Narayan Pandit, who had been one of the instigators here, she said, you rascal, your lifetime studies are for nothing. Because you've criticized Vaisnavas, you wicked soul, I should immediately sever your head from your body. Know that only Narottam now can save you from damnation. And poof, she vanished. Again, a vision. So waking up from sleep, Rupa Narayan was trembling in fear. And as soon as, he could take his bath, he took his bath in a nearby river. And he prepared himself. And then he went to Raj Narasimha, the king who had organized this whole thing. And he shared his dream with him. So hearing this dream, how, Durga had appeared to this Pandit and what she had said, this pious king, Raj Narasingha, he was silent and very pensive for some minutes. He was just thinking. Then he spoke. He said, Panditji, let us go now to Keturi. Let all these Pandits go back. Let you and me go to Keturi and take shelter of this great Vaishnavacharya, Srila Narottam Das Thakur. So they sent all the Pandits back, and the two of them walked. Usually the kings, they ride on palanquins. And this great Pandit also, he was carried on a palanquin. They sent the palanquins, and in bare feet, they walked to Keturi. And when they got close to the place where Narottam Das Thakur was residing, they got down on their hands and knees. And they crawled to where Narottam Das Thakur was. And they fell at his feet. And they begged sincerely, they begged for forgiveness. If one expresses remorse, one can be forgiven. Just like Jagai and Madai. What greater sins could one commit than really Jagai and Madai had committed? Madai had actually taken a pot and hit the head of Nityananda Prabhu, caused blood to come. But Mahaprabhu forgave them because they expressed genuine remorse and they agreed to give up their sinful ways and chant the holy names of the Lord. So they're there at the feet. They crawled there. They crawled to Narottam Das Thakur, the king and the greatest Pandit of the times. And Raj Narasingha, he spoke first. He said, Dear Lord, we are the most fallen and abominable men, but we have realized our foolishness. What's more, we have recognized your divinity and are convinced that Krishna Prem is the goal of life. Then he paused, and he couldn't hold back his emotion. He started crying. And a voice, trembling with emotion, he said the most important words of his life. He said, "Sir, would you be so kind as to accept us as your disciples?" The most important words one can say in one's life. Because the spiritual master delivers us to real life, Krishna consciousness. He said, "Would you be so kind as to accept us as your disciples?" So what did Narottama do? He picked them up and he embraced them. And I was so surprised to read that the next day he granted them diksha, an initiation. And after spending a few days with his spiritual master, Raj Narasimha, he went back to his kingdom and he got his wife, the queen. Her name was Rupa Mala. It'd be a beautiful name for a girl, Rupa Mala Dasi. He got Rupa Mala and he brought her back and he asked Narottama to initiate her as well. Now Narottam Vilas, the book Narottam Vilas says she was a devoted wife and a lady of beautiful disposition and pious like the king. Actually, there's an exact quote from Narottam Vilas describing her. Or rather, it's Narottam Das Thakur observing her. Because the guru has to observe the disciple, just like we have a period of waiting. You approach your spiritual master and you wait. I think it's 2 years now, the GPC has given a resolution where you can observe the guru and be convinced of your decision, and the guru can observe you. So Narottam Das Thakur, he observed her. And this is what Narottam Vilas says, quote, "Thakur Mahasaya was very happy to observe her beautiful nature and gave her initiation. And Rupa Mala was so happy that she swore to her Guru Maharaj to chant 100,000 names of Krishna a day, meaning 64 rounds of japa," unquote. Hare Krishna. Just give me a little break here. This is bliss. So, unlike Srinivasacharya and Shyamananda Pandit, I was reading, Narottam never returned to Vrindavan, but he stayed on the preaching field. He made Vrindavan wherever he went. He kept expanding the Sankirtan movement, mainly in Bengal. And Keturi was his headquarters because he had those 5 deities, Krishna and Gauranga. And he would travel out from there and he would preach and spread the chanting of the holy names. He stayed in one place. And how many times have we said, how close the two of them were, Ramchandra Kaviraj. Remember one lecturer said they were like one soul in 2 bodies. And they were constant companions. And just how much, because they had very deep interest in Krishna consciousness. They wanted to go deeper and deeper and deeper, and they went together. So how close were those 2 souls? That is real friendship. And just how close Ramchandra Kaviraj was with this constant companion, or how close how close Ramchandra Kaviraj was to Narottam Das Thakur is there in his song. Narottam sings. I think the song is called Anakata Na Balibo. There, it's in Prem Bhakti Chandrika. Narottam mentions, he says, I think it's verse 18, Ramchandra Kaviraj se sanga mori kaja, tara sanga vina sab sunya, Yadi janma hoy punya, tara sangha hoy yeno, tabahe Narottam Danya. He writes, and I can think of some of my friends like this too. I desire the association of Ramchandra Kaviraj, he writes. Without his company, the entire world is a desert. If I must take birth again, I would feel myself fortunate to have his association. Whew. I desire the association of Ramachandra Kaviraj. Without his company, the entire world is like a desert. If I must take birth again, I would feel myself most fortunate to have his association. You see, they're all very intense relationships on the spiritual platform, with God brothers and God sisters, with Guru, with Krishna. They're all interdependent on each other, actually. By associating with our God brothers and God sisters, we understand how to properly serve our spiritual master. And by serving our spiritual master, he reveals to us how to serve Krishna. The science of Krishna consciousness. Hari Guru Vaishnava, Bhagavata Gita, Narottam sings. And he, besides Ramchandra Kaviraj, Narottam also enjoyed visits from time to time from one of his old preaching partners, Srinivasacharya. So one day, Srinivasacharya came to Kituri, and he told Narottam Das Thakur that he was going to Braj, he was going to Vrindavan, and he wanted to take his disciple, Ramchandra Kaviraj, with him. This was heartbreaking news for both Narottam and Ramchandra Kaviraj, but they surrendered to the will of Srinivasacharya. So this part's a little difficult, actually. That some months passed by, and one day devotees coming back from Vrindavan, they brought the very sad news that Ramchandra Kaviraj, while in Vrindavan, had departed this world and gone back to the spiritual sky. And soon afterwards, it's written, his spiritual master, Srinivasacharya, feeling so much separation from his disciple, Ramchandra Kaviraj, gave up his body. He went back to the spiritual world. Now, both these personalities were so dear. You know, Narottam went to school in the sense he studied in the ashram of Jiva Goswami with Srinivasacharya, Shamananda Pandit. They traveled together to take the books to Bengal. They preached, they kept in touch, they met. And Srinivas is gone, and Ramchandra Kaviraj, to Narottam was like life itself. They left. But no one wanted to tell Narottam, because they knew how devastating it would be for him. He was already living in separation from those two persons, Srinivas and Ramchandra, who went to Braj. It was also already too difficult. But to hear that they'd left this world, no one wanted to tell him. But they had to tell him. So finally, Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi, he was deputed to inform Narottam that Srinivas and his most beloved friend, Ramchandra Kaviraj, had departed. So I was reading, it took Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi days to work up the courage. And one morning he walked up a small hill where Narottam had his humble bhajan kutir. He lived in that way, a humble way. And he slowly approached the kutir. And he stood outside for a long time, building up more courage. And finally, he spoke up, but in a very soft voice outside the door. He said, Guru Maharaj, may I speak to you? And by the tone of his voice, it said that Narottam could understand something was wrong. So he said, my dear Chakravarthi, what is it? But really nothing could have prepared Narottam for what he was about to hear. And then Ganga Narayan, he took a deep breath, and closing his eyes, he said, "My dear Lord and Master, Srinivasacharya, and your dearmost friend, Ramchandra Kaviraj, have left this world." How could anyone say those words to Narottam? "My dear Lord and Master, Srinivasacharya, and your dearmost friend, Ramchandra Kaviraj, have left this world." It was so hard to read. And then I read there was a pause. And then Ganga Narayan, he heard this cry of grief come from the heart of Narottam Das Thakur as he fell to the ground inside the kutir. Only recently I was reading in one of Prabhupada's Vyasa Puja offerings to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, I think with the 1930s, that when he received the news that his spiritual master, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, had left, he said, "I gave a cry of grief." It's obviously more than that, but again, eloquence is truth spoken concisely. Prabhupada wrote like that, a cry of grief from in the inner recesses of the heart. So Narottam, there was this cry of grief, and all Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi, he just heard him collapse in the hut. So no one wanted to disturb Narottam in that stage of grief. So Narottam, he just remained in his hut. And later, I was reading, the disciples saw him run into the jungle, where they could hear him weeping and weeping for days, alone, in separation from Srinivasacharya and Ramchandra Kaviraj. Then he returned to his bhajan kutir. And you know what he did? He composed that famous song, Sva Parshada Bhagavat Viraha Janiti Vilapa, which we customarily sing, when a Vaisnava departs. Yaya Nilo Premadana. The first song. We'll be reading that song a little bit later, but Yaya Nilo Premadana. So he wrote that song then. That's when that song was written, in the full mood of separation from the Vaishnavas. And he was singing it in so many ways, because he was also, it was also for him, it was also a lifetime of separation. He missed Chaitanya, he missed Nityananda, Dvaita Gadadhar, Srivas, Swarup Damodar, Ramananda Roy, Mukunda Datta. And then now he's bereft of the living association of two of his most dearmost companions. So he wrote the song. That's when the song was written. When I read that, it meant so much more to me. So Narottam stayed alone in his kutir, grieving and lamenting in separation. And finally, one day, he called for his followers. And he said, "Please follow me." And they were nervous because they could perceive his mood. He walked with his intimate followers, disciples, associates. He took them and he walked down to the bank of the Ganges. And he instructed them to build a funeral pyre. You know how we see in India, the bank, I've seen many on the banks of the Jamuna, there's the burning ghats there. They build it out of wood, big solid wood, and smaller wood, and then brambles. And they built a funeral pyre. And then, to the shock and dismay of everyone present, Narottam climbed up and lay down on that funeral pyre. And he said, "When I leave my body, you light the fire." So a lot of emotions churning here in this pastime. So for 3 days he stayed like that, until gradually his life faded from his body and he left this world. And as per the instructions of his disciples, Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi came with the torch to light the funeral pyre. And just as he was about to do so, some smarta Brahmins, some envious Brahmanas, they passed by and they made a comment. Can you believe it? They said, such is the fate of this wicked person, Narottam, who's created such a disturbance in our culture. A low-born man initiating Brahmins. Finally, he got the fever of death. Good riddance. So hearing this blasphemy, Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi displayed the Vaishnava quality of compassion, the crest jewel quality of a Vaisnava, a Vaishnavi. And he went to the funeral pyre, where the body of his guru was laying, who'd left, and he touched the feet of that dead body. I don't like even to describe it as a dead body because it's transcendental. Not anything that a pure devotee uses in the service of Krishna and such devotion is transcendental. That's why we put the bodies of our acharyas in Samadhi. They touched the feet of Narottam Das Thakur, and then he whispered into the ear, he said, Guru Maharaj, don't let these brahmanas go to hell for their offenses to you. Please save them. And then suddenly, one of the most miraculous things ever to happen in the glorious history of our Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition happened. There on the bank of the Ganges, in the presence of all the Vaishnavas, as well as those blasphemers, suddenly Narottam came back to life. And when he did, his body was as effulgent as the sun. And what's more, a mystical, sacred thread appeared on his body, shining like millions of suns. Hare Krishna. He comes back to life, he's effulgent, and he has this mystical, full Brahman thread on his body, shining like millions of suns. And as he sat up, it's described, a shower of flowers fell from the heavens. Like you take a shower, showers of flowers. Then he climbed off the funeral pyre. Of course, the devotees were happy, but the envious brahmanas, they were stunned. They were stunned. And all their ignorance was removed. And they also fell at the feet, begging for his mercy. So the Narottam, he walked back to his bhajan kutir. And there he remained very deeply immersed in this mood of separation from Ramchandra Kaviraj, Srinivasacharya, Mahaprabhu, Nityananda, all the great souls. And several days, he stayed, I was reading, he didn't come out, but those brahmanas kept coming to near his residence and was begging Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi and all devotees, we've realized our foolishness, we were ignorant, we were offensive, but we want to become his disciples. So on their request, he came out of that bhajan kutir in a state of lamentation. He sat down and he gave them diksha. He accepted them as his disciples. This is Vaishnava. Vaishnava puts aside all his own interests, even if they're deep spiritual interests, for the sake of the fallen people. This is the heart of our movement. We live for others, actually. We can't even comprehend all our good fortune. So we live for others. We live to share our mercy with others. And this is so nicely demonstrated by Narottam Das Thakur. He came out, sat down, and he gave them diksha. And then he said, now you should have a big festival. Why? Because that was the most glorious day in the lives of those brahmanas since they left the kingdom of God. Now they're on the way back home in earnest. Festival. Narottam Das Thakur. So finally, one day Narottam collected a few of his very intimate and very close associates and disciples, and this time he took them down to the Ganges. And they knew what was going to happen. And then he stood in front of Mother Ganges for a long time with folded hands, and he was saying prayers to Mother Ganges, to the previous acharyas, to the Panchatattva, to Sri Radha and Krishna. And then without saying anything, he walked into the river, the Ganges River, up to his waist. And he turned to Ramakrishna, his disciple, and Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi, I was reading, difficult to read. And he said, massage my body with Ganga Jal. So those two disciples, and others were watching, they took the water and they would put it on his body like that. And as they were doing that, by putting that Ganga Jal on his body turned to milk. And that milk ran into the Ganges and mixed with the Ganges. And as they saw what was happening, these two disciples, they were trembling. But they'd received order from Guru, so they couldn't stop. And the more they massaged him, the more he began to disappear. Until finally, there was nothing left of his transcendental form. The milk had mixed into the Ganges. But fortunately, one of the senior Vaisnavas present, mad with grief and lamentation, he took a pot and he dipped it into the water. And he collected some of that milk mixed with the water. And later the devotees took that mixture and they made a samadhi out of it. It's present there at that, the other day I mentioned the house of Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi, some 4 or 5 hours north of our Mayapur Chandadayar Mandir, where the famous golden deity of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is still being worshipped. So they took that milk and water, and in the courtyard there of the home of Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi, they made the Dut Samadhi, a Dut Samadhi. There's a Pushpa Samadhi of Narottam Das Thakur at the Balagokulananda temple in Vrindavan, but that there's some of his artifacts there, next to Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Samadhi there. So you could say his full Samadhi is, the Dut Samadhi is there, and wow, when I learned that, I was so grateful. And I spent a long time at that. The Samadhi is basically, it's underground, but there's just a little, like a shrine this big on the ground there. And next to him is the Samadhi of Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi. And Srinivasacharya and Ramchandra Kaviraj, we remember their samadhis are where they passed away in Vrindavan, down not far from Gopishwara Mahadev, down the road there a little bit. There's that courtyard, that whole area. They call that Srinivas Kunj. That's where they are, Hemlata Goswamini. So it takes some effort to get to Narottam Das Thakur's samadhi, but please go. It's very much worth it. You'll see the golden deity of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You'll see the Radha Krishna deities of Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi. You'll see his Shalagram Shilas. The people there are very accommodating. The descendants of Ganga Narayan Chakravarthi. And you see the samadhis. You can have kirtan, and it's just such a transcendental atmosphere. And you can hopefully remember all these things that we've shared with you. So, what can I say? After he passed away, devotees came from everywhere to honor him. They came from Vrindavan, they came from Orissa, all over Bengal, they came from, South India. They came to honor him. And they had kirtan after kirtan after kirtan for weeks. It was something like a little Keturi festival. I read that somewhere. Not on the same scale, but the same intensity of bhakti, of devotion. And then I read something I just fell over when I read it. Well, I didn't really fall over, but I couldn't believe it. They had one kirtan where so many Vaishnavas all crying in separation from Narottama. And it was the finest, it was the final and biggest kirtan. And in that kirtan, Narottam Das Thakur, unable to bear seeing the suffering of all his followers, he appeared in their midst and he began dancing with them, much like Mahaprabhu and Nityananda did at the Keturi festival. It's documented. People wrote about it. Narottama appeared and everyone went mad with ecstasy, and then he disappeared and everyone fell apart. Then you know what happened? He came back, he appeared again in the kirtan. And he went to each and every Vaishnava at that event. He spoke with them, he consoled them, and he said to each one of them that he would always be with them. I shouldn't speak about myself, but I wrote a letter to Prabhupada one time. He just left our temple in Detroit. I've said this many times, but it's relevant. And in the letter to Prabhupada, I wrote that I'm going to miss you. I'm going to feel your separation. This is a new bhakta, but again, there's a pure devotee from Goloka Vrindavan, so I'd only been a devotee a few months. And I said to Prabhupada, I gave him a donation, everything I had, $10. I said, I didn't get initiated yet, but hoping I will. And here's $10 for your book fund, and I'm going to really miss you, I said. So Prabhupada wrote me back a couple of weeks later, and he noted that, the leaders had said that I was doing good, and if I continued following the process, and he said, now always follow in the footsteps of advanced devotees. That's one thing he said. And he said, in due course of time, we'll accept you as my newly initiated disciple. And then he said, I can very much appreciate your feelings of separation. He said, I am also always feeling separation from my Guru Maharaj, but I always feel that he's watching over and protecting me. Prabhupada wrote that. I said, I'm always feeling separation from my Guru Maharaj, but I always feel that he's watching over and protecting me. So that letter had meant so much to me when Prabhupada departed, because that was also intolerable, the separation. But I kept remembering that letter. He said, I'm always feeling separation from my Guru Maharaj, but I'm feeling separation, but I always feel he's watching over and protecting me. So we hear the same thing here. That Narottama, when he appeared the second time in that kirtan, he spoke with each devotee, and he consoled them, and he said to each one of them that he would always be with them. So these transcendental truths, they come down from generation to generation to generation to of Vaishnavas and devotees. Such a wonderful tradition we're in. And then he disappeared for the last time. What more can I say? Nothing more to say, because there were no more pastimes. He left. And then his pastimes began again in the spiritual world as a manjari, serving under Champaka Lata, boiling the milk, and etc., etc. So there's not much more to say. And surely I've tried my best. And hopefully hopefully by churning this deep ocean of nectar in the lifetime and the pastimes and the poems and the songs of our beloved hero, Rasik Bhakta, stalwart preacher, Narottam Das Thakur, now more than ever we're more attached to him. This is the mystery of Krishna consciousness. Although we feel closer now, we also feel further away because of the pangs of separation. We feel closer because we got to know him better, and we heard his glories, and we're making some progress, all of us. So we're more open and more able to understand these things. So we feel closer, but in feeling closer, we feel further away. What is this mystery of Krishna consciousness? It's just so mysterious and wonderful. So hopefully all these sentiments of, could we say Vipralamb and Sambhog? Sure. So hopefully all these sentiments one day will mature and become completely pure, and they will take us to his lotus feet. Because isn't it, at the end of our lives, after all that is said and done, we go to where our hearts take us. We go to where our hearts take us. So let's, just destroy all these foolish attachments we have to this world, which just end up in suffering birth after birth, and transfer each and every attachments to the lotus feet of the Vaisnavas, to our spiritual masters, to Srila Prabhupada, to our deities, to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Nitai, to Panchatattva, Ramananda Roy, Swarup Damodar, and the divine couple, Sri Radha and Krishna, and go home. And we won't have to be reminded of these things, because we'll all experience them day to day in the spiritual world, in the with all the residents of in the world where eternal, with the world's eternal, full of knowledge and bliss that's awaiting us. Didn't Prabhupada say we'll have our ISKCON in the spiritual world? So I'd like to finish today, in this mood of Vipralamba Bhav, by reciting this final poem or song that Narottam wrote. It was the last thing he wrote. It's there in Prem Bhakti Chandrika. We can recite that. I think it's the appropriate thing to do right now. Svaprasada Bhagavat Viraha Chandita Vilapa, Song 1. Parsada. Ye Anilo Premadhana Karuna Prachur Heno Prabhu Kotagela Acharya Thakur Kaha Mora Swarup Rupa Kaha Shanatan Kaha Dasha Raghunath Patita Pavan Kaha Mora Bhatta Juga Kaha Kaviraj Ekakale Kotagela Gaur Natharaj Pashane Ketibo Nata Mata Anale Pashibo Goranga Gunara Nidhi Kota Gela Pabo Sheshaba Shangira Sange Jay Kilo Bilas Sheshangana Paya Kande Narottama Das. He who brought the treasure of divine love and who was filled with compassion and mercy, where has such a personality as Srinivasacharya gone? Sometimes it's said Advaitacharya. Sometimes it's said Srinivasacharya. In my heart I can feel it. It's Srinivasacharya because he just left when this song was written. He who brought the treasure of divine love and who was filled with such compassion and mercy. Where is such a personality as Srinivasacharya gone? Where are my Swarup Damodar and Rupa Goswami? Where is Sanatan? Where is Raghunath Das, the savior of the fallen? Where are my Raghunath Bhatta and Gopal Bhatta. And where is Krishnadas Kaviraj? Where did Lord Gauranga, the great dancer, suddenly go? I will smash my head against the rock and enter into fire. Where will I find Lord Gauranga, the reservoir of all wonderful qualities? Being unable to obtain the association of Lord Gauranga, accompanied by all these devotees, in whose association he performed his pastimes, Narottam Das Thakur simply weeps. Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhus. We come to a conclusion of our series on our beloved Narottam Das Thakur. We also discussed Shyamananda Pandit and Srinivasacharya, our trio of heroes. We will move on. It's difficult to move on because it's so relishable to speak about your heroes, isn't it? We get so much inspiration to go deeper into Krishna consciousness. We study Prabhupada's books. We serve him, serve his mission, and we preach. We share our good fortune with others. So, but we will move on. There's other acharyas to pick one for the next lecture, and eventually we'll get back to Vrindavan itself, and of course we have the whole wonderful world of Krishna consciousness in Navadvip Mayapur Dham. So our future is very bright. Thank you. Shishi Gauranitai ki, Shishi Krishna Balaram ki, Shishi Radha Shama Sundar ki, Vrindavaneshwari Shrimati Radharani ki, our most beloved hero Narottam Das Thakur ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, back home, back to Godhead ki, and like Narottam Das Thakur, let's try to assemble as many people as we can and take them back home, back to Godhead with us. We'll all there we'll all assemble at the lotus feet of Srila Prabhupada, the master at whose feet all masters sit. Hare Krishna. Thank you.